Good morning. So, it's interesting about this topic of sex, marriage, and divorce. As I was mentioning to the children that we'll be talking about this as they were leaving, that the children might also go. I noticed a few parents wanted to sneak out too, and that's okay. It's a sensitive subject. About 3 years ago, this also came up as part of our readings, and I decided I would skip it at that time and not even bring up the issue of sex, marriage, and divorce because it's a very sensitive topic, and one that, as a pastor, I felt like it's inappropriate for me to talk about a topic that's so sensitive until we've had a chance to actually get to know each other a little bit. It's interesting with the whole issue of sex and marriage and lust that is a big part of what our culture is about. You look at newspapers that use images in order to sexually excite us, in order to get us to buy their products. You know, anything between ice cream to cars and everything has images of sexual exploitation in order to help stimulate something in our minds about that product, to get us interested. It's been said of marriage that Adam and Eve may have had the best possible marriage. And this is because Adam could not have been reminded of all the guys that she could have married. And of course, she was never reminded of how good his mother's cooking was. So it was the perfect of all kinds of marriages. But for the rest of us, we recognize that there are always ongoing issues as we talk about our marriage and our sex. And it's interesting to talk about this subject because as people come to turn their lives over to God, one of the primary issues that gets transformed is our relationships with other persons. And who is that person that is most affected by that transformation? But that person who is closest to us in a marriage relationship, that one other that we have committed ourselves to be with. There was a joke that was out there on the internet where a woman who was fairly cantankerous was talking with a belligerent guy. And she, at the end of this conversation, said, "Well, if you were my husband, I would have poisoned your drink." And she looked at him and said simply, "Dear, if you were my wife, I would drink it." Marriage can be tied to some of our life's greatest happiness and also tied to some of our greatest heartaches. And as we approach this subject, I think all of us can recognize that we're all in the same boat. None of us has made perfect career record in dealing with sex and marriage in our lives. We all come with this as a heart that is broken and recognizing that this is a place in the church where we can find healing in the midst of our pain and suffering. I love the words of Jesus who says, "I have come to seek out the brokenhearted and to bind them up in the Spirit of God." Now, this is from Luke 4, where Jesus is describing his ministries to bind up the brokenhearted. And that is what the church needs to be about. You know, for those who are broken, the church needs to be a place that is as a hospital, a place for healing, a place for wholeness, where brokenness is understood and is finding its remedy. There are others who recognize that they may have been the cause of pain in other people's lives. They've been the cause of pain in this area of sex and marriage. And in that way, we recognize that the church is a community of persons who are forgiven sinners. We've all messed up. We've all made mistakes. And that this needs to be a place where we can come to common ground and recognize that we are all at the same ground. We're all in need of forgiveness. But even in the midst of that, we recognize that the church is also a place where we can find hope. Sometimes when we look at the brokenness in our own lives, the brokenness in other people's lives, and the marriage life of the United States, it's said that almost 50% of those who get married get divorced. It's 45% of marriages end in divorce. That means that at least almost half of us are dealing with having a history of divorce in one way or another. In all of that, how do we help one another to look for hope in the midst of our trouble? So we look today at the words of Jesus, who helps us recognize as we're looking through the Sermon on the Mount that we're not just talking about a surface issue. In the same way that in the last week we talked about how murder isn't just about killing another person. Jesus said, if you have anger in your heart, it's as if you have murdered another. Today's scripture says that it's not about external. It's not whether or not you've just committed adultery. It's not just about whether or not you have gone into bed with another person. It has to do with an attitude of your heart and your mind. And Jesus makes it even more difficult. He said, if you've ever looked at another person with lust in your heart, it is as if you have committed adultery. Wow. That is tough. And I think one of the main reasons as we look through the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus makes things so tough is he helps us to recognize that we are all in the same boat together. There is a pastor, Rob Weber, who says of the church, there's not one of us who cannot say, me too. This is what it means to be part of the church, is to recognize that we have all failed. And as we look at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus continues to point out the absolute perfect, 100%. And in that way, it becomes as a mirror that when we look into it, we recognize that all of us have fallen short of God's 100% best for our lives. And so when he talks first about this issue of lust, and we recognize that it is not just a surface issue, but it's something that goes down deep inside. But I'd like for us to think about it in some bigger terms, about how God uses sex in our lives. And I want us to first recognize that God invented the thing. God invented sex. And in that way, God said it is good. In fact, when God had created Adam and Eve, before they had even fallen, He said, go forth and multiply. He had given them sex as a good thing for them to enjoy. He hardwired it within our genetic piece that we might be disposed towards sex. God is not somehow surprised looking down on humanity going, what are they doing? I give them everything, and what are they? God is not surprised by sex. He gave us sex that we might enjoy it. And as we recognize that that is one of God's great gifts for us, we recognize that God has given us the gift to be used appropriately. And that is where we start to think about that. So it's nice to put together this whole passage, what Jesus has been talking about. Because just as He had talked about anger and how we shouldn't murder, and anger being an internal thing, He then goes on to talk about some practical applications. He says the practical application is that we should reconcile in our relationships with one another. So that the proper relationship, if we're dealing with internal pain, is in our relationships with one another. That was the former passage. Now as we look at this passage, when he's dealing with the issue of adultery, he's talking about lust. He says the appropriate place for lust is to now talk about the relationship in marriage. What he's saying is that the proper place for sex is within the context of marriage. Marriage is a place that provides the solace, the agreement, the grounds for which marriage and sex can be brought together in a whole and complete way. Because sex is such an intimate piece of who we are. Not only is it hardwired into us that we are biologically predisposed to want to procreate. You know, it's one of the ways that children are created. I don't know if you're aware of that. But that's kind of a primary way that it happens. But not only is that the case, but it also brings together, not just biologically, but it also brings together two people in a social, emotional, psychological, well-being kind of way. It's in the vulnerability of two people coming together that the soul is brought together in a very intimate and dear way. And so Jesus wants His disciples to recognize that in that coming together, there is a holiness to that sacrament, that connection in sex, that cannot be duplicated or falsified. And He wants to warn His disciples against lustfully looking out for others. In Jesus' day, there were two schools of thought dealing with divorce. One of the schools of thought looked at the words of Moses that said, if a woman is seen to be indecent to her husband, or she displeases him in some way, he should write her a certificate of divorce. Now, one school of thought was very strict, which said simply that only unless a woman continued after another man, that is, in adultery, only on that grounds could divorce be granted. But there was another school of thought that actually had become the more predominant school of thought that said that if a woman displeased a man in any way, that he might give her a certificate of divorce and send her out, dismiss her. Now that could have been any grounds whatsoever. There are, case law for the time in which a woman had oversalted the soup, and so he divorced his wife. Or perhaps she had gone out of the house without her head covered, and so he dismissed her. He divorced his wife. And Jesus is looking to the occasion of when a man might be looking outside of his marriage saying, ooh, there's the new attractive model. Someone described this as the car deal century type of marriage, where when the new models come out, the guy goes, I want that next model down the line. Jesus is warning the disciples that lust should never enter into that understanding of marriage. And so He guards marriage. He says, for men, and it's always that Jesus is talking to men, men, you are not allowed to put away your wife just because you're looking for the next model. That's not okay. Jesus, in his comments to his disciples, is speaking against the position of power for men to simply able to dismiss the wife for any and all reasons. Now, in Jesus' day, divorce was a horrible thing, and it's still a horrible thing. I have a family member who is going through a divorce, and in talking with her about it, she said, I would never wish divorce on even my worst enemy. It is so, so heart-wrenching. And her marriage and her divorce was relatively painless. But she says, I can't imagine if it was any worse. But Jesus he's talking with the disciples about marriage and where they're supposed to guard marriage. If in Jesus' day a woman was dismissed, where would she go? The man was the only one who was allowed to hold property or basically have a career outside of the home. The woman, if she was divorced, had to either go back to her parents' home or to go out on the street to make a living. Now that was impossible in Jesus' day. That would be a very, very difficult situation for the woman. And so Jesus is safeguarding society, safeguarding the bigger picture, not only of marriage, but of the relationships between men and women and society, by saying that unless there is, extreme grievance in the marriage, only on that occasion can there be an occasion for divorce. So to understand more about this, Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 7, when he's talking about the relationship between a married person who is married to a non-believer. And that non-believer who might have a different understanding of what marriage is about decides that they no longer want to stay in a relationship with a Christian. And Paul says to that person, he says, if your non-believing husband decides to leave you, decides not to honor your relationship in marriage, that's okay. You can walk away from that relationship. Now, for Paul to be able to say that it's okay to walk away from a relationship shows that Paul understands something of what Jesus meant in that context of marriage and divorce. Meaning that if there's an occasion where there is grievous offense that continues to speak against and undermine the marriage, that there is some grounds for the splitting apart of those two persons. That is, of course, if there's no reconciliation that is possible. Jesus always encourages persons to work towards reconciliation. Always encourages them to seek the benefit of the other. Our society today would say something interesting about sex. It would try to tell us that sex is all about physical binding of two persons coming together. And what's interesting is that we're still wrestling with the introduction of a new technology in the 60s. Birth control. It happened. And it has changed our society immensely. And society would want to tell us that because we have now a technological solution to the problem of two people coming together producing a child, you no longer have to deal with the replications or the results of coming together physically. And therefore, we don't have to worry about sex as an issue socially because it's only a physical issue. But it's missing the deeper issue. That is, that sex not only speaks to the biological coming together of two persons, but it also speaks deeper to the social connection of who we are as society. It misses the emotional impact on each and every person as they come together physically. It misses the psychological piece. And the way I would phrase it this way is that there's a whole lot more going on below the surface than what we can see when it comes to lust and sex. There's a whole lot more to it. In fact, as I've now been married 12 years, I've realized that sex is not about sex. Sex has a whole lot more to do with emotional relationship with another person. And if that is broken, then sex is broken. And that if sex, if anything, is just a physical act, it is missing the bigger picture of God's gift to humanity. And that when God said to Adam and Eve, therefore they become one flesh, He meant truly that there is something that brings them together to bring wholeness and joy and satisfaction together. Used appropriately, it can be a great blessing in persons' lives. But our society would want to tell you that it's only a physical act and there's nothing below the surface. But Jesus realizes it's so much bigger, so much deeper to who we are and what we're about. And so He wants to safeguard our marriages. And Jesus says, be on guard against lust. Do not let your eyes determine the direction of your feet or other parts of your body that lead you into trouble. Do not let your hand cause you to stumble. And so He talks about this passage. If your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it into the pit, so that at least you might enter into heaven without limbs, but at least you'd make it to heaven without these things. Now, Jesus is not telling us to literally gouge out our eyes. We might then become the community of the blind church at that point. Interestingly enough, in the early Christian church, others had taken it more literally and missed the whole point. One of the early church fathers, by the name of Origen, went and castrated himself, saying, I am no longer going to lust, I'm going to take this literally, and he got himself castrated. Now, he recognized, I don't know how long after that it didn't solve the problem. He was still lusting after others. And he said, woe is me. I think he really woes him. But we recognize that it's not a flesh issue. It's not just a surface issue. It goes much deeper than that. It goes into the heart issues. The heart issues of brokenness that come from society and family structures. How do we want and connect with another human being? And those issues that come up in that honest connection and being able to deal with who we are individually are seen and exposed in our sexual relationship with our marital partner. I mean, how often does the emotional piece just come up and you're like, where did that come from? There's a big piece of who we are sexually that speaks to the deeper part of who we are. And Jesus wants us to guard our marriage. He wants to guard our life against lust. And so he has an interesting discussion about how lust affects us. I found in a book describing a relationship of lust by a pastor in England. He shares this story. He says this story, this is where I fell and I really messed up. He said, on one evening, I was going out to speak at a meeting and I knew that the next day I was having some friends over for lunch. And I thought, what are we going to have for dessert? And I remembered that there was a double chocolate cake in the freezer. I took it out of the freezer early that afternoon and I put it in the fridge so that it would defrost slowly and be ready for a meal the next day. So I went to my meeting and arrived home late. And when you do ministry or a hard day at work in the office, as many of you do, you come home and you're tired and you're vulnerable, and especially if you come home alone. So I came home and I thought, I am going straight to bed. I'm not going to eat anything. And then I thought, I'll just have a glass of water before I go to bed. I went into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and I started sipping the water. And suddenly I remembered that I put the double chocolate cake in the freezer or the fridge to defrost. I was just curious, and I wondered, has it defrosted yet? And I thought I would just have a look-see to see if it had defrosted. So I opened the fridge door, and you will not believe what happened next. As I opened the fridge door, the double chocolate cake spoke to me. It said, hello, Mike. And I, of course, being a gentleman, said, well, hello, double chocolate cake. And then the double chocolate cake said, well, how are you? And I said, oh, well, I'm okay, and I'm very tired, and I've just come home from a meeting, and I'm going to bed. And I asked, just to be polite, well, and how are you, chocolate cake? And the double chocolate cake said, well, I'm okay. I'm just very bored in this fridge. I only have lettuce and 2 tomatoes to keep me company. And then I said, well, listen, you're tired and I'm bored. Why don't you put me on the kitchen table and sit down and we can have a little chat? Then you can put me back in the fridge and go to bed. So I thought, well, that sounds fair enough. It's only a little chat, and I'm drinking my water, so I said to the double chocolate cake, we'll have a chat, but I'm not going to eat you. And then the double chocolate cake said, well, of course not. You've had your evening meal, and I am, of course, for tomorrow. Well, we got that out of the way, so I put the whole double chocolate cake on the table. And we had a sort of late-night conversation you have with double chocolate cake. Then after a while, I said to the double chocolate cake, listen, Cakey, because of the stage we're getting intimate, I just was wondering, are you defrosted? And the cake thought for a moment and said, you know, I'm not quite sure if I am defrosted. Of course, there's only one way to find out. If you just rub your finger along the cream and have a little taste, then I bet you can know. So I just run my finger through Cakey's cream to have a little taste. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that technically, and not eating the cake, is it? So I had just a little taste of the Cakey's cream and said, Cakey, your cream is defrosted, but I want to know, are you truly defrosted inside? In the heart of you? And Cakey thought for a moment and said, you know, I don't really know. The only way to find out, of course, is if you cut a little sliver of me, just a little sliver, then you can put me in the cream and just do the frosting over it, and no one will know the difference. And I thought, well, that's just a perfect thought. Just a little sliver, if I don't, I will not know if it's defrosted. So I had a little taste, and I said, Cakey, you are defrosted deep down in the heart of you. Well, that night, one thing led to another, and by the end of the evening, the whole double chocolate cake and I were of one flesh. He goes on to say, I wish I could stand here and tell you that every mouthful was agony. It was horrible, but it was not. It was wonderful. I loved every moment. And do you know, as I was eating keiki, I thought, this seems so right. What could be wrong with this? I'm not hurting anyone. We're not hurting one else, are we? Keiki and I, we love each other, and I loved it. That's the problem with sin, isn't it? It's nice at the time. If that double chocolate cake had been cold Brussels sprouts, guess what? I would not have opened that fridge door. No problem. I loved eating keiki. And until the very last mouthful went down my throat, then when I finished, I looked at that empty plate. I looked at that spoon and the little chocolate crumbs, the knife and the bits of cream sponged across the edge. And wouldn't you know, they screamed at me, "Murderer! Murderer!" And I thought, what have I done? I've killed keiki. I have killed keiki. Immediately, I felt ill. This is horrible. This is horrible. I don't know what to do with myself. I just feel sick. Why did I do that? The problem with sin is that at that time, in that moment, it's nice. But afterwards, it's payback time. All that evening, I had payback time. Where did I go wrong? I kept thinking about myself. Where did I go wrong? When I opened the refrigerator door, that is when I went wrong. Do not open the fridge door. And we are all like that. And you know, I'm not just talking about chocolate cake. Of course, I am talking about strawberry cheesecake, cream puffs, meringue pie, and of course, I'm also talking about sexual intercourse outside of marriage. Do not open the fridge door. What a great illustration this is. To think about how we can engage. You just think about lust. Oh, it's not so bad now. Just a little piece. And then, of course, the aftershock of the whole event, where it screams back at us. And the devil is tricky this way. He leads us into various areas, and then the more we follow it, the more we feel guilty for doing it. The devil is just tricky that way. Martin Luther said it this way, we cannot stop the birds from flying over our heads, but we can stop them from making a nest in our hair. Jesus wants for the church to be aware that if we allow for ourselves to enter into temptation, we find ourselves struggling and even lost in that struggle. So there are some helpful things that we might keep in mind. James 4 says it this way, he says, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Come near to God and he will come near to you. In a similar way, in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says to the church there, he says, no temptation has seized you which is common to men. No temptation has seized you which is not common to man. But God is faithful. If you look to him, he will provide a way out for you when you are tempted. So the scriptures would tell us that in the midst of our temptation, we change our focus, we change our attitude, we change our energy to focus on God rather than on this thing. I've talked about temptation in the past as getting involved with a tar baby. You touch it, you poke at it, and the next thing you know, you're all involved in it. Or maybe if somebody else would say it this way, don't think about purple elephants. And the next thing you do, you're thinking more about purple elephants. And you keep saying, don't think about these things. And the more you try not to think about it, the more you're engaged in thinking about it. Temptation is a lot like that, particularly in the area of lust. Because with lust, it is hardwired into us. Because we are sexual beings. Now, with that in mind, the suggestion that Christ gives us is that instead of focusing on not doing this thing, we should focus instead in putting our energies towards what Christ would have for us. Positive Christian action, where instead of trying to figure out the energies of confining or caging in our ambitions, we would rather unleash them to do God's work, to focus our energies on doing those things that God has called us to do, and to allow our mind to be reworked. You know, the more we think about something, the more we think about something. You know that's the case? The more you think about some subject, the more it becomes a part of your normal thinking. So it makes sense that if we are wanting to follow after God's best for our lives and to do what God asks us to do, we might try to put into our mind those things of God. Memorizing Scripture, connecting with worship, memorizing some hymns or songs of praise, listening on the radio to things that are glorifying God rather than tearing us away from God. How do we allow our mind and our actions, those pictures around us on our wall, our newspapers, even our Facebook page, how do we put things together that help us to generate in our mind those directions that move us towards what God will have for us in the best for our lives? As we do so, we find our actions start to reflect our thoughts. Just in the same way that Jesus was telling the disciples, in the same way what's below the surface is going to determine your life action. So don't lust after somebody if you don't want to get stuck in adultery. Don't hate somebody if you're not wanting to murder them. The idea is that the internal peace eventually works its way out into behavior. In the same way, let us turn our hearts and our minds over to God. Transform them by the renewing of our mind. Let us follow after His best. And as we do so, we find our actions are transformed. Now, all this being said, we recognize that we are a place in the church that is primarily a place of healing and restoration. In the church, it's always a chance to start over. We've all messed up. None of us can say that we haven't. Paul, I think of the words of Rick Warren in talking about his own struggle with marriage. And he says that my wife and I will be celebrating 20 years of marriage. And we like to say that we have celebrated 17 years of blissful marital connection. The first 3 years, of course, were just hell on earth, a living torture. For many of us, marriage itself can be a struggle, can be torturous. So how do we protect marriage within the church? How do we help those who are struggling, even in the concept of sex? First is that we need to be able to talk about it. Be able to share openly and honestly with one another that we all are in the same boat together. The other thing is to seek help, to recognize that there are help available. Counseling is available. My wife and I have, in our 12 years of marriage, seen at least 4 counselors for a season of time. I think counseling is not a sign that your marriage is weak, but a sign that you recognize that you need help. Between 2 people, you can do some great things, but you need others to help when you get to a place where you're stuck. I encourage people to find counseling, to seek out workshops on marriage, to talk with others who are prime examples of what a good marriage can look like. This church has wonderful examples of persons who've been married for a long period of time. Sitting down and talking with them about how they work through similar issues that you yourself are going through is a primary way of getting input into your marriage, and to be able to work with others to go through this. We need to be able to protect our marriage. I encourage all couples to go on a date. Remember those first time when you were dating, and you first saw each other across that crowded room and you said, I like that person. That's a good-looking individual. They've got a great sense of character. That was what you saw first. Those first things you did in order to get to know that person, do those things again. Allow for the marriage life and the flame of passion to be kindled again within your marriage. And I know that as a married person who has a child, I know it doesn't just happen. We don't accidentally slip into good marriages. There are a few people who are, I think, absolutely blessed, who their marriage is just absolutely blissful. From the moment they get married, it just seems that everything is wonderful and easy, and I just don't know how in the world that happens. Because I know that the statistics would tell us that the greater majority of those who get married struggle with it each and every day. Because it's not always easy. And so I would encourage everyone to not judge one another. Do not judge another based on their discussion or their marriage, but give us the benefit of a doubt. Let's have that safety zone, that as a church we can be honest with each other and recognize that we're all working through some hard times, some struggles together. So, taking Jesus' words to heart, He reminds us that we are to follow after God, to not allow for lust to creep into our heart and our relationships, because that will destroy us. I'll leave by saying this final thought too, and that Jesus also commends singleness. For those who have found themselves single either by choice or by result of life action, Jesus actually said it's the preferred position for those who are in the kingdom of God, because they are not divided in their thinking and their ability to please God, to do His will. So, with all of this being said, we recognize that God's grace is available for the church. This is a place of healing, a place where we can grow together, and a place where we can look to God to guide our steps and actions together. Let us pray. Lord, we thank You for the gift that You give us of sex and of marriage. Lord, we recognize that this is such a sensitive topic. And Lord, as I've had a chance to share what this thought is through the Scripture, I know that Your Spirit is already at work in our hearts, probing us and moving within us, stirring us to thoughts and how we can work through those painful areas in our lives. And so, Lord, I just ask for Your Spirit to continue to pour out on us. That you would bring healing not just to us individually, but as a whole, as a church. That as we work towards that best of what you have for us, that we might be an example for our community, an example for those who are struggling. That you might help bring wholeness in this area in our lives. We thank you for this through Jesus Christ, our Lord and our Redeemer. Amen. I invite you to stand as we sing the song of response.